Let's talk about parentification and how it affects attachment style. Leslie Wells, connection coach here. I help individuals improve, thrive, heal, and repair in their relationships by looking at things through an attachment lens. So your attachment style is something that you gain from childhood. You don't have any control over it, but it's not necessarily fixed. So I'll work with people to actually help them identify that and then learn tools and skills to be able to adjust their attachment style and go from an insecure attachment style to a secure attachment style. It's all backed on science by John Bowlby from the late 1950s and the 1960s, and it's been scientifically proven over and over again. And it's the biggest predictor of how and why we show up the ways that we do in our romantic relationships. So parentification is when the child is forced to step up and step into the role of a parent because for whatever reason, the parent is going through their own struggles, so they're not able to show up in the appropriate way for a child. So the child's put in the situation where they inappropriately are sort of doing the things that a parent should be doing for them, and the roles are reversed. So there's actually two types. There is emotional parentification and there is instrumental parentification. And the difference in those is in one situation, the child is managing the emotions of the parent, or they're having to constantly get the emotions of the parents maybe dumped on them and figure out how to help the parent process their emotions. So in a good child-parent relationship, the parent actually is very attuned to the child, to their needs, emotional needs, and will step in when they have big emotions or feelings and will help them process them, help them regulate, and they are sort of the model for how the child learns to do that. But in the case of parentification, the child is the one who is emotionally trying to help soothe the adult and the parent. So in instrumental, it is when the child actually steps in and actually does things for the parent. So let's say that it's a situation where you maybe have a parent who is an addict, a parent who is maybe bipolar, maybe there's some mental health issues, some personality disorders going on there, and the parent comes home and they're drunk. And so the child has to actually put them to bed, like has to help them eat because they notice that they don't eat a lot, or set their alarm for them to get up and go to work in the morning. The child is actually doing things that the parents should be doing for themselves or for the family. I actually see this happen a lot with families that have a bunch of children, and so sometimes the older children will get stuck sort of doing the things for the younger children and having responsibility for the younger children that the parents should have, like having to get them out the door, like getting them around to all of their, after school activities. And there's different levels of this, right? So it's okay to help out with your family and to step in for other siblings, but whenever you have the responsibility and it's too much responsibility for your age, or it's too frequent, or it's too much, it can lead to parentification. Sometimes this is expected of the child and sometimes it's not. So there can be positive or negative feedback about this. If a parent is, let's say that a parent is going through a divorce, and so one of the parents is constantly dumping all of their emotional baggage onto their child, and they are talking about how much they can't stand the other parent, what the other parent has done, and they're sort of looking for their child to soothe their emotional wounds or just to vent, and they're dumping that on their child, which, by the way, is never, ever, ever okay. Every child deserves the right to decide for themselves what they think about their parents, and they deserve the right to love both of their parents equally, no matter what they have done in the marriage. This is absolutely never okay. It has long-lasting consequences that lead into adulthood, and no matter what age, it does not bode well. So you have this parent that is emotionally dumping about the other parent onto their child. And so the child then feels good because they have that connection. They're getting time with their parent. And the parent may give them positive feedback and say things like, I'm just so glad you're here for me. I'm so glad you listened to me. I don't have anyone else to talk to. And so there's positive feedback in that. And if they're maybe not available, then the parent may make them feel guilty about that, or be like, you're just never around. Like, I really need to talk and you weren't here. So they can very much learn that their worth comes from being present and able and available to serve others. And the problem with this is that they can go into adulthood looking to relationships naturally because we seek what's familiar, going into relationships trying to fix other people, and so they end up in very, very bad situations. The other thing that they can learn is to self-abandon their own needs because they're so busy showing up for the parents' needs that they are unable to even take time to identify their own needs. They don't have a parent who is emotionally available or physically available to actually identify their needs and help them identify their needs. So they really learn to abandon their own needs. So let's go into how this affects attachment styles. I see a lot of my fearful avoidance that tend to end up with dismissive avoidance and I think a lot of the time that is because they naturally are looking to fix, or they're looking for a project and they are accustomed to their needs not being met because they were parentified or they did not receive consistent, proper emotional attunement or instrumental, because they usually come from a background of trauma. So for the fearful avoidant, I see them very much, a lot of times they will take on way more than they need to, because again, it's tied to that worth. So they will overdo, and end up in situations where, like with a dismissive avoidant, where they're pouring into the relationship and their partner is not. It's a very much like as unequal of a partnership as you can get. And so what happens is this resentment builds and then they blow up. So then they go into that fight response and then they shut down and go into their trauma response, because they're basically like, I'm not seen, I'm not heard, nothing's appreciated. So I sort of see that push-pull as a result sometimes of this parentification. I think it's also a lot of why they often will move the goalposts. So when they do have the needs and they are like, actually think that you're going to meet them, they will constantly move them because they don't trust that you're going to actually meet them, because they're not used to having the experience of somebody showing up well and meeting their needs. So for the DA, a lot of times I see DAs with families that do more of the instrumental. They show up in instrumental ways, but they don't show up in the emotional ways, right? DAs grow up with absolutely no emotional attunement, which is why they don't have any. So they will do things for their partner when their partner is in crisis or they're upset. Sometimes their way of handling it, first of all, they have emotional blinders, so they don't know when their partner's in distress. But if you directly tell them, like, I'm having a hard time, they'll usually jump in and try to fix it or serve you with physical things. They'll buy gifts, they'll go out there on errands for you, but they don't show up with the emotional attunement. Because as a child, if they were constantly doing things for their parent in the instrumental type of parentification, and their parent was not emotionally attuned at all, then there was no feelings. There was no emotional attunement that they received. They never learned it, so they don't know how to give it. So this can very much play out, and what they did know to do as a child, if they grew up with parentification, was they knew how to step in and actually do things for their parent. But if they were always doing that, and the parent was not emotionally attuned, then they very much were taught to put their feelings down, put them aside. There was never any space for their feelings as a child, and so they don't have any space for them as an adult. So for the anxious preoccupied, a lot of times they very much, again, that worthiness is tied to the parentification, to being able to serve others and show up well for them. And their fear of abandonment is really around that. They will do anything, basically, jump through hoops to keep their partner, because that fear of abandonment is so present. And if they received intermittent reinforcement as far as the emotional attunement and the instrumental attunement, meaning that as a child, their parents sometimes showed up really well, and then other times they didn't. So that love, that nurturing, that attention, that validation was constantly given and then taken away, given, then taken away, which creates intermittent reinforcement. So they start to manage the emotions and the duties and the tasks around them to get their needs met from their parent. And so they learn that in order to get their needs met, their need for connection, for security, for safety, all of that they have to serve others and self-abandon their own needs and put the needs of others first. So another thing that's important to remember is that children do not know they're being parentified when they're being parentified. This is like normal to them. This is like their lifestyle. They don't know anything about it. So a lot of times I work with adults that it's not until very, very later in life, much later when they're in a marriage or they're a parent and have their own children, that they start to actually recognize the dysfunction that was in their household when they were younger. Or they start to really recognize that they are self-abandoning their own needs, or they have no capacity for the needs and the emotions of other people. So hopefully that shows you a little bit about how parentification can affect someone and how important it is for a parent to be the one who's emotionally the caretaker of the child versus vice versa, and that the children should not be stepping into the roles as a child, because it does have long-lasting effects.